Benzene Exposure Control Plan. Purpose. The purpose of this program is to reduce employee benzene and other hazardous chemical exposure to below the permissible exposure limits by means of engineering and work practice controls of Plaas Incorporated. This program meets the requirements of OSHA Standards 29 CFR 1910.1028 for benzene. Definitions. Action level: an airborne concentration of benzene of 0.05 ppm calculated as an 8-hour time weighted average. Authorized person: any person specifically authorized by the employer whose duties require the person to enter a regulated area, or any person entering such an area as a designated representative of employees for the purpose of exercising the right to observe monitoring and measuring procedures under paragraph 1 of this section, or any other person authorized by the Act or regulations issued under the Act. Benzene. Liquefied or gaseous benzene. It includes benzene contained in liquid mixtures and the benzene vapors released by these liquids. It does not include trace amounts of unreacted benzene contained in solid materials. Benzene is a toxic, colorless, and has an aromatic odor, is not soluble in water, and is flammable. Container: any barrel, bottle, can, cylinder, drum, reaction vessel, storage tank, or the like, but does not include piping systems. Emergency: any occurrence such as equipment failure, rupture of containers, or failure of control equipment that may or does result in an unexpected significant release of benzene. Employee exposure: exposure to airborne benzene that would occur if the employers were not using respiratory protective equipment. Permissible exposure limit. The OSHA limit for exposure to airborne hazards for benzene, the limits are 1 ppm TWA and 5 ppm STEL. Regulated area: any area where airborne concentrations of benzene exceed or can reasonably be expected to exceed the permissible exposure limits. Short-term exposure limit, STEL, airborne concentration averaged over any 15-minute period. Time-weighted average, TWA, airborne concentration averaged over an 8-hour time period. Responsibilities: the program administrator will issue and implement this program and ensure that it meets applicable requirements. Provide hazard communication training for benzene. Implement engineering and work practice controls to prevent exposure to benzene above the action level. Provide appropriate personnel protective equipment for exposed employees. Maintain exposure monitoring and medical surveillance records according to the record-keeping section of this program. Provide medical surveillance service for exposed employees. Ensure medical removal protection for all affected employees. Managers and supervisors will know and understand the hazards of benzene exposure. Comply with all engineering and work practice controls in place to prevent benzene exposure. Provide time for medical services for exposed employees. Ensure the availability and use of appropriate personnel protective equipment for exposed employees. Employers should be aware of the owner's contingency plan provisions. Employees must be informed where benzene is used in host facility and aware of additional plant safety rules. Employees will comply with all aspects of this benzene exposure control program, attend scheduled hazard communication training, use engineering and work practice controls in place to prevent benzene exposure, use personnel protective equipment as necessary to prevent benzene exposure. Program activities. Plaas Incorporated works to ensure that employees are not exposed to benzene above the action level at any time. Monitoring. The written program shall include the schedule for developing, implementing, and engineering the work practice controls. Plan should be reviewed and revised to reflect the most recent exposure monitoring data. Individual monitoring at job sites suspected to have benzene exposures will be conducted to characterize employee exposure to benzene in a worst-case scenario. Representative samples are taken in the breathing zone over a full shift to obtain an 8-hour time-weighted average for each job that may have benzene exposure. STEL monitoring may be necessary for operations where there is a reason to believe exposure may be high. Representative 15-minute samples are taken in the breathing zone of these operations. Where initial monitoring indicates employee exposures at or above the action level, periodic monitoring will be conducted annually or more often if conditions change, such as further monitoring is appropriate. Where exposures are found to be above the PEL, monitoring will be conducted at least every 6 months. Additional monitoring will be conducted wherever there is a change or process control equipment that could impact employee benzene exposure and after the cleanup of any spill, leak, or other failure to verify that the exposure levels have not changed from the levels measured prior. Employees will be notified of all exposure monitoring results using the attached form, Employee Notification of Monitoring Results for Benzene. Engineering and work practice controls. Wherever possible, Plaas Incorporated will prevent employee exposure to benzene above the action level or to the other hazardous chemicals by implementing engineering controls. Engineering controls include process improvements, containment improvements, etc. Where engineering controls are not feasible, work practice controls will be implemented to prevent benzene exposure above the action level. For work sites where engineering and work practice controls are not feasible or sufficient, the following program activities apply. Employees may be exposed to benzene during their job duties in such areas as the following. 1. Petroleum refining sites. 2. Tanks gauging, tanks at producing pipeline and refining operations. 3. Field maintenance. Respiratory protection. Respiratory protection will be used in accordance with the Plaas Incorporated Respiratory Protection Program in compliance with OSHA 29 CFR 1910.134. Respirators shall be selected in accordance to airborne concentrations of benzene or conditions of use. These shall be approved by NIOSH. Respiratory protection shall be selected as appropriate for the benzene hazard as below. Personal protective equipment, including respiratory, eye, skin protection appropriate for the hazard, will be supplied at no cost to the employee. Medical surveillance. Medical surveillance will be made available to employees exposed at or above the action level 30 days out of the year and to employees exposed at or above the PEL 10 days out of the year. All medical services will be provided by licensed healthcare professionals and accredited laboratories in a convenient location at no cost to the employee. Initial exam will include history, physical exam, cardiopulmonary function tests, and blood count, as well as other assessments deemed appropriate by the healthcare professional. Annual follow-up exams will include blood count and other assessments as determined by the healthcare professional. For exposures that occur in an emergency situation, urine tests will be conducted and additional blood counts will follow within 2 weeks if abnormalities are found. Plaas Incorporated will supply the treating healthcare professional with a copy of the OSHA Regulation 29 CFR 1910.1028, a job description for the exposed employee, exposure monitoring results, information about the required personnel protective equipment, and any available previous medical information. The healthcare professional will provide Plaas Incorporated with a written opinion including all occupationally pertinent medical information, an opinion on continued benzene exposure, a recommendation for limitations on benzene exposure if appropriate, and a statement indicating that the above information has been shared with the employee. Medical removal. When an employee is removed from workplace benzene exposure by a healthcare professional, a follow-up will be provided after 6 months to determine ability to return to the normal job. When an employee is temporarily removed from a benzene exposure job, they will be transferred to a non-exposure job at the same wage with no loss of seniority or benefits until they are able to return to their normal job or it is determined that they cannot return to their normal job duties. When an employee is permanently removed from a benzene exposure job, they will be offered a non-exposure job at the same wage with no loss of seniority or benefits. For employees losing time from work because of healthcare professional removal, protection benefits will continue for 6 months or until the employee is placed at another job. Communication. All regulated areas will be labeled with signs as follows: danger, benzene, cancer hazard, flammable, non-smoking, authorized personnel only, respirators required. Containers and pipes containing benzene will be labeled with signs as follows: danger, contains benzene, cancer hazard. Material safety data sheets, MSDS, for benzene will be kept at locations where exposure to benzene is a possibility. Training. Plaas Incorporated employee right-to-know training will include training on benzene according to the benzene training attachments included an explanation of OSHA Standard 29 CFR 1910.1028. Record keeping. Exposure monitoring and medical surveillance records will be maintained by Plaas Incorporated using the forms in the attachments of this program for 30 years. Exposure monitoring records are available for employee review and for the area director upon request. Medical surveillance records are available for the affected employee and for the area director upon request. Fire protection. Benzene liquid is highly flammable and vapors may form explosive materials in the air. Fire extinguishers must be readily available in areas where benzene is used and stored. Health effects. Short-term effects of overexposure may include irritation of eyes, nose, and skin, breathlessness, irritability, euphoria, headache, dizziness, or nausea. Long-term effects may result in blood disorders such as leukemia and anemia.